So, welcome to APH's Access Academy. Sometimes you need a concentrated burst of information, and today this is what you get. This is what it means, and it's going to be in Nemeth concepts. Our webinar today welcomes back APH's very own Kyle DeJute. She's speaking on UEB with Nemeth Bouillon Cubes. Kyle, it is great to have you with us today.
Thanks, Amy. I am very happy to be here. I love talking about Nemeth Code. On the screen, along with our title, UEB with Nemeth Bouillon Cubes, is a picture of sort of a vegetable and pasta soup and a wooden spoon pulling out of that some circle-shaped pasta that's arranged in the shape of Braille cells. What we have in these Braille cells is the opening Nemeth Code indicator, the 3 cells that in Nemeth Code say X squared or X superscript 2, and the Nemeth Code terminator. I expect that when we're finished today, all of those cells will feel more familiar and sort of warm, like comforting soup to you after we've spent some time with them. Oh, by the way, my name is Kyle DeJute. My official title at the American Printing House for the Blind is Braille Trainer. I like to say that means I get to push up my Braille nerd glasses for all sorts of reasons within the company and for people who are reaching out for information to APH. Basically, I get to talk about Braille codes with loads of different people who are studying Braille codes. And please don't let me neglect in my profile picture here on the slide. There's me. I'm a white woman with short brown hair, giant glasses, and in this picture, tomato slice shaped earrings. But behind me, there's another little person with dark brown hair who's peering over a couch. That's my little kid who is often home helping me make these slides and materials. That's who I am. What are we doing today? We are going to really appreciate the lower cell numbers of the Nemeth Code and how they help to make notation concise. That is, they let us use fewer Braille cells to communicate concepts. We're going to meet and, like I said, get cozy and familiar with the symbols dots 456, dots 146, and dots 456, dots 156. That's the opening Nemeth Code indicator and the Nemeth Code terminator. We're going to talk about some of the sort of sweet and helpful rules that Nemeth Code has in regards to things like the letter X with the number subscript 2. So X2. 2 more things. We are going to talk a little bit about the APH product math symbol reference booklets, and we're going to appreciate the fact that normal people make templates too, and talk about how maybe we can make templates for work that we do in future, and look at one place in Braille Blaster where a math-related template is available to you. That's our quick summary of what we're doing today. Let's dive into the more specifics. First off, vocabulary, terminology, and primary sources or code books. On September 21st of 2020, BANA, or the Braille Authority of North America, officially adopted a document. The title is very helpful here, whose title is Terminology, UEB Math/Science and UEB with Nemeth. So the intent of this document is pretty inherent in the title. Our BANA recommended terminology for the 2 kinds of math or science transcriptions that we could do in the United States are, quote, UEB Math/Science and UEB with Nemeth. You can get to that document from a link on this slide, which should also be active in your PDF of this PowerPoint, and explore that position statement as well as some other fact sheets from BANA. So again, for our flavor-filled soup of UEB with Nemeth, where we sort of have Nemeth Code dumplings, the BANA approved, BANA recommended terminology is UEB with Nemeth. So it's a context of UEB, and within it, it has bubbles or dumplings of Nemeth Code. To clarify, our UEB math/science, which we certainly in the past have called UEB technical, is a transcription created following only the rules of UEB. And that includes the guidelines for technical material. That's just part of the full rules of UEB. For much more and a different kind of flavorful discussion of UEB math/science, last month we did a webinar called UEB math/science, frozen juice concentrate. If you want more information, that's a great place to look. Let me be super explicit here. The Nemeth Code is separate from Unified English Braille. They are two separate and distinct Braille codes. I did notice in the chat that somebody said they just received their math symbol reference booklets. I'm looking forward to talking about those. I also think they're really great. So Nemeth Code, what is it in more detail? It is a Braille code, again, separate from the Unified English Braille Code, that is especially good for math and science. It was designed, the Nemeth Code was designed in the 20th century by American mathematician, Dr. Abraham Nemeth. Dr. Nemeth is a member of APH's Hall of Fame, and there's a picture on the screen of Dr. Nemeth in his later years holding his cast metal plaque that goes in the Hall of Fame. His creation of the Nemeth Code was a significant contribution to the Braille community. And while he did design the code and was the leading expert in the code as it was developing and growing during his lifetime, none of us does this entirely alone. There are other people who supported him and who went to him for advice. And in fact, now that he has passed, there are people continuing to work on the Nemeth Code and keep it up to date and consistent and expand it where really necessary. The Nemeth Code, to get to know it even further, is its own code, and it is internally consistent. It was designed by a mathematician. Dr. Abraham Nemeth was a working, studying mathematician when he found he needed some way to write down the math concepts that he was thinking about. And he needed some way to take notes in class and explore his ideas in an efficient, accurate manner. So he came up with the Nemeth Code. The Nemeth Code is still an active Braille code in the United States. Like I said, there's still a group of people who are maintaining the code and preparing a 2022 edition of the Nemeth Code. And it is one of the active codes in the US, along with Unified English Braille Code and the Music Code, as well as the Braille Code for the International Phonetic Alphabet. One more characteristic I want to highlight of the Nemeth Code is that it's a highly detailed code, giving not just specific instructions for which dots to use for which mathematical concepts, but also giving specific instructions about how to format Braille on the page at that sort of page level spacing in order to keep things consistent and practical for the Braille user. And now it's time for our first poll. The question is, what is the BANA recommended terminology for a transcription created by following the Nemeth Braille Code for mathematics and science notation? If you were to do a transcription tomorrow using UEB and Nemeth, what is the BANA recommended terminology for that transcription? Is it Nemeth within UEB contexts, Nemeth Code, UEB with Nemeth, or nothing but Nemeth?
Our audience today is a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. They are in this poll sharing out very quickly. So I will go ahead and share out really quickly just to keep things moving. So, well, we had 27% that said UEB with it. Excuse me. I totally misspoke. Let me start over again. Sorry, Kyle. Nemeth within UEB contexts. But 70% say UEB with Nemeth. A few people said Nemeth Code.
The correct answer about the BANA recommended terminology is that if you were to create this transcription and name it tomorrow, you would call it UEB with Nemeth. To clarify, that answer choice A was a little tricky because the name of the currently active document, Guidance for Transcription Using Nemeth Code Within UEB Contexts, uses that phrase, Nemeth within UEB contexts. And the BANA recommended terminology, like for paperwork, for IEPs, and ordering from contracting agencies, is UEB with Nemeth. The goal of this wording is partially to quickly, at the very beginning of the phrase, distinguish a transcription created using the Nemeth Code bubbles from a transcription that would have been created using EBAE, or English Braille American Edition, and Nemeth Code. If we just call it a Nemeth Code transcription, then it's unclear whether that's maybe involving EBAE, which would be pretty out of date at this point since the US adopted UEB in 2016. The phrase UEB with Nemeth is also supposed to be designed to be sort of short and sweet, so you don't have to read a big long phrase in order to know what code combination you're dealing with. Again, this is definitely the BANA recommended terminology for things like paperwork. The alternative current code transcription, the BANA recommended terminology for all UEB math and science is UEB math/science. See how they both start with UEB? But then you just have to look at the next code name and you know which beast you're dealing with. Can I just confess to you all that when I made these questions, I really enjoyed making the option nothing but Nemeth, and I almost made it, oops, all Nemeth. Do you guys know about those, like the cereal that's Lucky Charms maybe says, oops, all marshmallows, or oops, all berries? It's Captain Crunch who says, oops, all berries. That's not the BANA recommended terminology. Oops, all Nemeth. No, the BANA recommended terminology is UEB with Nemeth. Okay, that horse is dead, Kyle. Please move on. Ladies and gentlemen, please let me introduce you to the bubbles. I feel like there should be a sound drop here that goes, my name is Bubbles. But what I really want to introduce you to is that math and technical notation, so not just math, but chemistry as well, is presented in Nemeth Code when we're doing a UEB with Nemeth transcription. That Nemeth Code happens between code switch indicators, and those create what I personally call bubbles of Nemeth Code. Those bubbles are surrounded by Unified English Braille. So the narrative text is in UEB and the math or technical notation is in its own bubble of Nemeth Code, which is separate from the UEB. Bubbles of Nemeth Code are created in the Braille with the opening Nemeth Code indicator. So continuing introductions, please let me introduce you to the opening Nemeth Code indicator. It is dots 4, 5, 6, and then the second cell, dots 1, 4, 6. And bubbles are ended with the Nemeth Code terminator. It also is 2 cells. It starts with dots 4, 5, 6, and its second cell is dots 1, 5, 6. On this slide in particular, these Braille indicators that we're talking about are preceded by the dot locator for mention, just like they would be on a special symbols page. So our UEB dot locator for mention is dots 4, 6, and a full cell, and then the actual Braille symbol or Braille indicator that we're talking about follows after that 2-cell dot locator for mention. And that lets us talk about the Braille cell without actually using it. I already made this joke about how our theme today is soup. Maybe instead of talking about Nemeth Code bubbles, we should be talking about Nemeth Code dumplings and how there's these little contained spaces of Nemeth Code which exist within the greater context or broth of UEB. Y'all, my brain is not quite flexible enough to make that terminology change just for this webinar. So I'm going to continue to say the word bubbles just to talk about those pieces of Nemeth Code that happen within the UEB context. But I invite you and urge you to enjoy a chuckle about them being called dumplings. Okay, here's our first concentrated burst of concept, which extends throughout all Nemeth Code transcriptions. And that's simply that the Nemeth Code has its Arabic numerals in the lower 2 rows of the Braille cell. So our letters, our lowercase letters, A through J in the Nemeth Code happen in the upper 2 rows of the Braille cell. And our Arabic numerals, our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, happen in the lower 2 rows of the Braille cell. So the numerals always look different from the letters because they happen in a different part of the Braille cell, sort of like they've been knocked on the head and just fallen down into the lower 2 rows of the Braille cell. Here's an example of that in action. But before we look at the actual Braille cells, please let me push up a different pair of nerd glasses and tell you this month, April, is among other national holiday months. It is National Financial Literacy Month. And there's a picture of a wire shopping basket like you might carry around the grocery store when you're trying not to buy too much. There's a picture of that sort of shopping basket on the screen because I just want to take a moment to say the way that a lot of governments figure out inflation is that they research the current cost of a basket of household goods, including groceries, but also rent and transportation. And then they add all of those costs together and compare it to what all that basket of goods cost, say, last year or 10 years ago. And the percent of difference is basically the percent of inflation. Fascinating. I like Financial Literacy Month. Back to the Braille. Our first example is the equation about interest, and it's capital A equals capital P, open parentheses, 1 plus RT, close parentheses. So this math equation is math or technical notation, and it has to happen within a Nemeth Code bubble. If we look at the specific cells, we see our capital A, our 2-cell equals sign. So that's dots 4, 6, and 1, 3. Capital P, open parentheses, and then a 1, which happens in the midst of a string of symbols. It doesn't need any kind of indicator to let us know that it's a 1 because it is in the lower part of the Braille cell and can be nothing but a numeral in this context. So then our rest of our expression is plus RT, close parentheses, and the Nemeth Code parentheses are just a single cell. The opening is dots 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. The closing Nemeth Code parentheses is dots 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we opened a Nemeth Code bubble, so we must also close our Nemeth Code bubble with the Nemeth Code terminator. Another place where our numerals are still in the lower part of the cell, but in this example, each numeral is preceded by a numeric indicator. And that's a little bit like the reasoning for that is a little bit like the dot locator for mention that we looked at earlier. Because the numbers in this example, each of them is preceded by a space, we use the numeric indicator to sort of give the Braille user something to hold on to before we ask them to read something in the lower part of the Braille cell. So pretty much any time that a numeral in Nemeth Code comes right after a space, only then is it going to need a numeric indicator. Our actual example in the Nemeth Code bubble is number 2 and B. Ooh, I love it. We don't need any special indicator to distinguish our 2 from our B. They happen in different parts of the Braille cell. So we don't have to worry about any extra Braille cells to distinguish them. Equals number 8. Delightful. I mentioned earlier that lower cell numbers in the Nemeth Code, which is all numbers outside of notations that aren't decimal, that aren't base 10, but you'll know when you're dealing with that if we're talking about hexadecimal notation or something else. All numbers that are Arabic numerals need an indicator when they follow a space. They also need an indicator in situations where they could be misread as punctuation. This is maybe the other side of the coin of having the lower cell numbers. Punctuation also happens in the lower part of the cell. Now, the vast majority of the time, there's no punctuation involved in our equations and other math expressions. But when a numeral and a punctuation could be confused, we can use indicators to distinguish them. There are some Nemeth Code symbols like the asterisk, the crosshatch, the paragraph or pilcrow sign, and the section sign. The Nemeth Code symbols for those include the Braille cell, dots 3, 4, 5, 6. So in order to avoid confusion, that's another place that sometimes we need a numeric indicator for an Arabic numeral. And again, one more time, those lower cell numbers, most of the time, if a number follows a space, we need a numeric indicator to give the Braille user something to hold on to. For more discussion about numeric indicators and when not to use them, please let me recommend lesson 7 in the excellent provisional revised Nemeth course manual that's available from NFB's website. In fact, the main author of this Nemeth course manual that will go live when the updated Nemeth Code is published, or after the Nemeth Code is published, this manual can actually become active. The main author of that manual also did a couple of webinars for the National Braille Association, specifically on numbers and when they do and do not need indicators, if you want to really go down that Nemeth Code rabbit hole. And it's time for our second poll. I know you're still out there. This is just a way for us to touch base. The question is, which is the correct UEB with Nemeth transcription of the expression Arabic numeral 4 C? So just 4 lowercase c. Your answer choices are available in simulated Braille or ASCII with Braille font applied on the screen, so it looks like a Braille cell. In your actual poll question, you can see the ASCII Braille. It's just the print characters that correspond to the Braille cells. So the difference between these answer choices is they're all in a Nemeth Code bubble. They only differ in that answer choice A has no numeric indicator, and then a 4 in the lower part of the cell and a C. Answer choice B has a numeric indicator, then the lower cell 4 and a C. And answer choice C has a numeric indicator, the lower cell 4, and an English letter indicator, that's dots 5, 6, and then the letter C.
Well, I will go ahead and share out with you. And Kyle, the majority of our friends here chose answer choice B.
That is correct. The correct UEB with Nemeth transcription of 4C, where the number and the letter are written together to indicate that they are multiplied. The correct transcription is numeric indicator 4C. And this is because the numeral 4 comes after a space. So we use the numeric indicator to give the Braille user something to hold on to. And there is no need for any additional Braille cells to distinguish the 4 from the C, because they happen in different parts of the Braille cell. Remember earlier when we talked about the asterisk, the crosshatch, the paragraph sign, etc. There are often symbols we need to look up as we do a Braille transcription, sometimes particularly a UEB with Nemeth transcription, because the code is so detailed and specific about which cells to use in which place. One helpful resource for looking up symbols and even seeing examples of those symbols in use is the math symbol reference booklets from APH. There's a little picture of them on the screen here. The math symbol reference booklets are just a pair of skinny booklets that are spiral bound. Each time you order math symbol reference booklets, it comes in a 2-booklet set. One booklet is called Nemeth Code, the other UEB. So one booklet is devoted to UEB with Nemeth symbols and examples, and the other booklet in the pair is devoted to UEB math/science symbols and examples. Each listing in the reference booklets includes the name of the symbol, the print sign or symbol, the actual print picture, and Braille cells of that symbol transcribed. The booklets are organized by level. So there's a beginner, an intermediate, and an advanced level, sort of based on the level of curriculum that these symbols most often appear in. And yes, of course, the picture that you saw earlier was just of the print, the sort of large print, high contrast version of the booklets. There is also an embossed pair of the booklets that's available. And there's a link on this slide to that Braille version of the math symbol reference booklets from APH. And we know no one resource is the end all be all. So there are some other resources that can be helpful in looking up symbols, including the Nemeth Symbol Library, which is a web page from test company Pearson, whose purpose is, quote, to allow individuals to look up Nemeth symbols and math-related terms using the words a student is accustomed to hearing. So you can go to that webpage and then just Control F and search for what your textbook or your workbook is calling a symbol, and probably find the listing in the library which gives the Nemeth Code symbol as well as some UEB with Nemeth examples. I also, in my username Braille Trainer on Quizlet, I've made a pair of flashcard sets. One of them is an abbreviated set of Nemeth Code symbols, good for refreshing your brain, maybe right before you dive into a UEB with Nemeth transcription. And the other is about Nemeth Code formatting. I did notice we had a question about number indicators. When I talk about when I talked about something, giving the Braille user something to hold on to when an Arabic numeral follows a space, I mean, when you are reading tactually a Braille cell or a series of Braille cells, it can be difficult when you just encounter one Braille cell after a space or after nothingness. It can be difficult to tell whether it's in the upper part of the cell or the lower part of the cell. And there is also a certain trickiness to telling whether it's in the left or right part of the cell. So when we finish reading after a space tactually, and we're looking at and we're feeling with our fingers a Braille cell that happens in the lower, where the dots are only raised in the lower part of the cell, it helps to have something before that which has dots both in the uppermost, the first row of the Braille cell, and in the third row of the Braille cell. So that gives the tactile Braille user something to orient themselves and know sort of how big the Braille cell is on that line, where the top and bottom happen. So when they read the cell that's actually the number, they can tell that it's in the lower part because they had that first cell, which has dots both at its top and bottom, to let them know where the upper and lower limits of the Braille cell are. I know the give you something to hold on to is not the generally used academic explanation for why we use a numeric indicator or why we might use a dot locator for mention before a series of symbols that happens only in the lower part of the cell. but that is what I mean. Please let me know if you have a follow-up question about that. So we talked about the Pearson symbol library and my little collection of Quizlet flashcards for just looking up some symbols. If you want to really get into the kitchen and be a cook with your Nemeth Code soup, there are some excellent study resources out there. One resource is the Nemeth tutorial from APH. So that's all online and goes sort of concept by concept. The Project Inspire is a new initiative from the University of South Carolina. It stands for increasing the STEM potential of individuals who read Braille. And it includes, Project Inspire includes a series of self-paced courses. So the link takes you to information about Project Inspire and specifically the page where courses 1 through 4 are listed. And each of these courses includes a series of videos. Each video includes a pause for some exercises that you can do at home, and then an explanation of the answers for that. Project Inspire is remarkable in that its material is quite recent, and there's a lot of material from Project Inspire for Braille studying students. It's not just a course for transcribers or those of us who are sight dependent and studying Braille for some reason. The Project Inspire materials are useful for those of us who create Braille for a tactile Braille user. The Project Inspire materials are also useful for someone who is a tactile Braille user. It's also true that Pearson has a series of Nemeth Braille Code focused lessons. Each of those comes in a zipped folder and is sort of a PDF with a PDF as well as a BRF with some explanation and examples. And please, let's not forget about our supportive chefs in the study kitchen, the National Braille Association, the California Transcribers and Educators for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and Visual Aid Volunteers of Florida. All of these organizations have resources of various kinds, including, I mentioned, the short webinars that National Braille Association has for its members. CTE BVI and VAVF both also have recordings of trainings and some written resources available. Let's look a little more closely at one of those, just a tiny snippet from Project Inspire. This is based on, I'm not giving you the answers here, but this is based on one of the activities that's in the midst of one of those Project Inspire videos, specifically lesson 2 of course 4. And in that link that we looked at earlier, just 2 slides ago, I think, course 4 is about geometry and tactile graphics for students in grades 3 to 8. One of the examples from that lesson deals with the 5-step modification of the Nemeth Code. So the 5-step modification in the Nemeth Code is used for modifiers that happen directly above or directly below a letter or a numeral or other symbol. This happens a lot in geometry where we have a line or just a horizontal line with no arrowheads above some letters. That means a line segment. Or maybe we have an arc above some letters. Or, as in this example, we have the letters M, N, and then a double-headed arrow or a horizontal line with arrows pointing both left and right above the capital letters M, N. This is definitely a directly above modifier. It indicates the line MN, right? Lines go on forever. When we don't have the arrowheads, it's a line segment because it's as long as it is. So for this, to transcribe this into Nemeth Code, we enter our bubble with the opening Nemeth Code indicator. Then we tell the Braille user what comes after this is modified by using a .5. What is modified is capital M, capital N, We individually capitalize our letters in the Nemeth Code. Each of these letters represents an individual point that's used to name the line, and it is identified and capitalized individually in the Nemeth Code. Then our next step is to tell the Braille user what comes next is above the MN. So the directly above indicator is dots 1, 2, 6. Then we transcribe the modifier, the thing that's above. In this case, it's the shape, a double-headed arrow. So the shape indicator is dots 1, 2, 4, 6. Our left pointing arrow is the same shape as an O, as an OW. Our our arrow shaft is just a regular length, so 2 cells of dots 2, 5. And our right pointing arrowhead at the end of this shape, that's the modifier, is the same shape as the letter O. Then we terminate, tell the Braille user, okay, that's it for the modification. And of course, we're finished with what we were transcribing, that's math or technical, so we must close out our bubble with the Nemeth Code terminator. Did you notice that the types of Braille cells here are color-coded? For those of us who are in some way using our site to examine Braille, this color coding can be helpful in the project Inspire materials, where certain kinds of cells are colored in a certain way in order to emphasize what group goes together as well as what's happening where. So in this case, the dot 5 that begins our modification is yellow. The directly above indicator telling the Braille user, hey, this is where the modifier happens, is red. And then our actual modifier, all 5 cells of it, is blue. And our terminator, the thing that says modification is over, is green. That's the kind of cell level detail that's happening in these Project Inspire materials. Okay, getting real serious here about Braille study and about Nemeth Code Braille study. The official certification course in the US, which is the only official certification course that I know of for Nemeth Code, is the Library of Congress course, which is administered by the National Federation of the Blind. Right now, that course is provisional because the updated Nemeth Code, which presents the Nemeth Code in a UEB with Nemeth environment, has not been published. The code book has not been published yet, so the course manual cannot be active. You can't get this particular certification yet, but the instructional materials are there, available on NFB's website in PDFs and BRFs. And before I go too far into talking about those materials, which I really enjoyed pushing up my nerd glasses about, I can tell you we talked in depth about certification courses in the webinar Navigation of Braille Certification. So if you have questions about getting officially certified in Braille codes, especially in the US, that's a great webinar that talks about literary certification, literary proofreading, math certification, and music certification. It's time to open a different package of Bouillon Cubes. That's about subscripts. At the very beginning of this webinar, we looked at a spoon that had a picture of some pasta in it. That was the transcription of x squared. But if that 2 were in the lower part of the Braille line and is a subscript to the 2, it's even sleeker. It's just 2 cells, the X followed by the 2. Don't need a numeric indicator here for the 2 because it comes right after a letter. And any time that a number comes right after a letter in Nemeth Code, it means it's a subscript. This saves us a lot of indicators and time, especially in chemistry transcriptions. So again, we do without the subscript indicator, keeping things slick and sleek for a simple numeric right, comes right after the letter, subscript to a letter. In the 1972 edition of the Nemeth Code, which is the only Nemeth Code that's currently published, Section 77 talks about this slick Nemeth Code rule. We're going to look at some examples of subscripts in action. But before we do, please let me pause to tell you again, April is Financial Literacy Month, National Financial Literacy Month, and pictured on the screen is an unlabeled, so just for visual appeal, line graph of one line curving up quickly and another line, sort of like a wheelchair ramp, progressing sort of slowly or progressing without great slope. This is the difference between the growth of a quantity with compound interest or simple interest. Because compound interest, every time there's a bit of interest, it gets bunched in with the main quantity. And then how much more percent you get is based on that, now bigger. And then you get more percent and it gets bigger. It gets compounded and goes really big pretty darn fast. Whereas simple interest, every time you get a percentage more, it's just always based on whatever you started out with. That's the end of this slide's financial literacy soapbox. Let's look at an example about slope. The equation that we have has 3 parts and is m equals the fraction rise over run equals the fraction y2, hey look, there's a subscript, minus y1 over the denominator, the lower part of the fraction, is x2 minus x1. So we're here with this example so that we can say, whoa, look at this y sub 2. It just takes up 2 Braille cells, simply the letter y and then the number 2. And when it's y followed immediately by a 2, we know that 2 is a subscript. I'm just going to do it one more time. Whoa, look at that x sub 1. That's so slick. The 1 just follows right after the x. And because of that special Nemeth Code rule, we know that 1 is a subscript to the x with no additional indicators crowding things up. One more. We talked about chemistry. The chemical formula for water is capital H subscript 2 capital O. Chemical formulas are technical or mathematical notation, and they happen within a Nemeth Code bubble. So we are transcribing our example here with an opening Nemeth Code indicator and a Nemeth Code terminator. The opener is followed by a space, and the terminator is preceded by a space. And what happens inside is cap H sub 2 cap O. How do we know it's a sub 2? Because there's that slick Nemeth Code rule. Anytime a number follows to the right immediately after a letter, we know it's a subscript. All right, y'all. Here comes the part where I'm going to open an additional program. How would you transcribe these examples in Braille Blaster? Duxbury Braille Translator, Braille 2000. Before I open another software program, I have a small confession, which has been true for a long time. I am not an expert in Braille 2000. I'm afraid I'll have to direct you elsewhere for information about how to transcribe these examples in Braille 2000. But I can talk we can talk for a few minutes about how you might transcribe these examples using Braille Blaster or Duxbury. So the example that I really want us to look at first, let's look at the fractions first, because they're the first ones in the slide, right? Just do it the way it is. If I were to transcribe m equals rise over run equals y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1 using Braille Blaster, I would figure out how to transcribe fractions first. And we do that using the the ASCII Math Hub. So in Braille Blaster V2, there's a Math drop-down menu, and the third option in there is ASCII Math Hub. That's going to open a separate dialog window for us. But before we go there, let's take a global view for a moment and make sure our Braille codes that we've chosen are correct. Are we actually working with UEB with Nemeth right now? Let's check. Probably not. Under settings in Braille Blaster, The second option is translation settings. So that's going to help us choose the translation tables that are going to be the series of decisions that our Braille is made from. We talked about translation tables a little bit in a webinar earlier this year called How Braille Works Electronically. Under settings, I go translation settings, drag the resulting window to where you can see it. And under standards, we have the Braille standard with a drop down, and we have 6 options available to us here. UEB is the default. There's also UEB uncontracted. There's Cherokee plus Nemeth, UEB uncontracted plus Nemeth. We haven't yet gotten to what we want here. We want UEB with Nemeth. UEB plus Nemeth. Aha, that's the one we want, not the Spanish, which is the last option. So here we choose UEB plus Nemeth. Now we're going to be working with the right translation tables for our fractions. After we hit OK. Don't forget to say OK. Tell Braille Blaster to actually apply that translation setting that you just changed. So we're using the UEB plus Nemeth translation setting, and we're going to go into that ASCII Math Hub, which is going to open a separate window for us that is the ASCII Math Hub. In the math categories dropdown, there are a couple of categories which are particularly useful if you're looking for just a specific symbol. I find the examples really helpful because the examples in the ASCII Math Hub give us actual full transcriptions of example content. So the example that I'm going to look at here is 123 over 12 plus 3. And what I get in my working window where I can enter text is open parentheses 123, close parentheses, slash, open parentheses 12 plus 3, close parentheses. This is ASCII Math, where the parentheses enclose the numerator when it's more than just a letter or just a number, and the parentheses on the other side of the slash enclose the denominator. This is cool because it's a template for a fraction that means I don't have to remember the ASCII math symbols for making a fraction. I just have to click on that example of a fraction, get that auto-populated in my working window, and then replace the numerator it had with the numerator that I want. For example, rise over run. So rise, I'm going to type in my parentheses, then I have my slash, then in my next set of parentheses, I'm going to replace 12 plus 3 with run. And maybe you can see, depending upon your eyesight and your display, in the upper window, there's a visual representation of the math that it would look like in print. Insert math, close the ASCII Math Hub. I've got in a red highlight in my Braille Blaster, the math that I just entered via the ASCII Math Hub. And it's the correct Nemeth Code symbols. I have my opening Nemeth Code fraction indicator, which is dots 1, 4, 5, 6. And then the numerator rise, the single cell stacked on top of each other fraction line, which is just dots 3, 4. And then my denominator run. And finally, my closing Nemeth Code fraction indicator. We have a bubble missing, though. So please let's remember to highlight that math we just inserted and go up to the math dropdown to choose Nemeth passage inline. So that's going to give us our opening Nemeth Code indicator and our Nemeth Code terminator like bookends on either side of the math we have. And I'm just going to insert that space that needs to come after the opening Nemeth Code indicator. And I just used my arrow key and the shift to select that space I inserted. And I'm going to go paste that space before the Nemeth Code terminator. So now I have my Nemeth Code switch indicators and my fraction, and my bubble is complete with the fraction rise over run. Yes, there is an example in the ASCII Math Hub of material that has a subscript. Spoiler, the ASCII Math symbol for a subscript is the low line. When you push shift and the hyphen and you get that low line, That's what you type in the ASCII math editor to get something to be a subscript. But before we go further on Braille Blaster, let's talk about how we might transcribe these examples in Duxbury Braille Translator, or DBT, if you will. Similar to what I did in Braille Blaster, I want to make sure that I'm working with the right codes first. So I'm just going to Control N or File New to make a new file. I want it to be a print file because that's my most flexible working file. And then I'm going to choose the template English UEB -BANA with Nemeth. And that's going to let me use the translation tables for UEB and for Nemeth, and then the code switch indicators that we use for a UEB with Nemeth transcription. Okay, so then I get my new print file here, and I want to make a fraction. So I could go into the quick reference that lists codes for Duxbury, and I could search for the word fraction. I'm going to spoiler alert you here, and I'm going to tell you what those codes are. First, I want to make my view a little bit bigger. Yes, no? Okay. The codes are start fraction, fraction start, fraction line, and fraction end. So we insert codes by pressing Control open bracket or F9 or under, oops, sorry, I went to the wrong drop down. You guys, I use the keyboard shortcuts so often I've forgotten where the drop down is for inserting codes. Well, we're just going to say you have to write Control open bracket to insert a code. And if you go to the webinar Foundations of Duxbury or Foundations of DBT, I'm sure I'll give a more complete explanation there. That recording is available to you now, the Foundations of Duxbury. Control open bracket, and then I enter my fraction start, just FS. I know my fraction is going to have to end at some point since it started. My code for that is FE. And then between those two codes, I'm going to need a fraction line. My code for that is FL. All right, excellent. So I want rise to be my numerator and run to be my denominator. And I want the whole thing to be in Nemeth Code. So I've highlighted that whole series of codes and symbols, and I'm going to choose the character style math by applying a style. I pushed F8 to apply a style in Duxbury. I choose the character style math. Now I can translate, file translate, or Control T. And what we get, I will make bigger, is an opening Nemeth Code indicator, opening fraction, rise. We already saw this in Braille Blaster. Fraction line, run, close fraction, and the Nemeth Code terminator. I think that for today, that is as far as I can venture down the Nemeth Code rabbit hole for Braille Blaster and Duxbury. If we have time at the end, I welcome your questions about specific tools, or we could return and just transcribe H2O or Y2 minus Y1. And I see a lot of people do 6-key enter Nemeth Code. And that's, we always want you to use the tools that get Braille out to students. There is no wrong way to generate the correct Braille cells that the Braille user needs. All right, I think I saw some questions in the chat that I want to make sure we return to before we move on too fast. So we talked about how there are a lot of people 6-keying Nemeth Code and also UEB technical. Sometimes you just need the right Braille cells in the right place, and that's fine. I know there was a question about Nemeth, and the full explanation of the status of the Nemeth Code course is in the Navigation of Braille Certification webinar. And the Cliff's notes of that, very short, is once the 2022 edition of the Nemeth Code is finalized and published by BANA, then the certification course can get its exercises and its final exercise, and that can be a path to certification. No one knows exactly what the timeline is for that. So I hope that answers that question. The 2022 Nemeth Code update is a product of the Nemeth Code Committee of BANA. So the Braille Authority of North America, that's made up of representatives from various Braille-related organizations throughout the US, had nominated a collection of experts to make the Nemeth Braille Code Committee, which then worked through the 1972 Nemeth Code, in fully incorporating all the updates that have been published since the 1972 publication. And that committee from BANA also has incorporated all of the material from the publication that I mentioned earlier, Guidance for Transcription Using Nemeth Code Within UEB Contexts. So now the 2022 Nemeth Code has all of the updates incorporated and also presents material in a UEB with Nemeth format. I'm so glad we got to spend some time with Braille Blaster and Duxbury, because I know a lot of us spend time trying to make Braille and trying to make it more efficiently. And I will return to those in a little bit so we can talk a little bit about templates. But let's look at some more Braille cells before we get too caught up in codebook updates and software. Within a greater context, we have the chemical symbol or the chemical formula, H2O. Would you drink H2O? Sure you would. So if we're doing a UEB with Nemeth transcription, the only thing here that's technical or mathematical content is the H2O. And that's all that needs to be in our Nemeth Code bubble, which is defined by the opening Nemeth Code indicator and the 2-cell Nemeth Code terminator. The punctuation that applies to our sentence is outside the bubble, and all of our narrative text, would you drink? Sure you would. All of that is outside the bubble as well. And look at our sleek little subscript, just being a numeral, following a letter. Are H2O and H2O2 the same thing? So the only things that are technical content here is the H2O and H2O2. Look at all of our subscripts being so sleek in Nemeth Code. The content of the sentence, the narrative text, are and the same thing. All of that is in UEB. For the word and, it's just one word happening between material that's technical. So we can use the single word switch indicator. That's dots 6 and then dot 3. And that single word switch indicator lets us avoid switching out of Nemeth Code, then having one word and opening Nemeth Code right back up. It's just for one word. It'll only work for one word, can't be 2 words in a row. But when we do have just one word, like in this phrase, R, open Nemeth Code, cap H to cap O, and cap H to cap O to, okay, end Nemeth Code, the same thing, question mark. We can use our single word switch indicator for that single word that happens between material that's technical or mathematical. So again, our opening Nemeth Code indicator is 456, 146. Our Nemeth Code terminator is 456, 156, and that's a Nemeth Code symbol. It only happens after the Nemeth Code has been put into effect by the opening Nemeth Code indicator. And our single word switch indicator is dots 6, 3. And that is a Nemeth Code symbol. It only happens after Nemeth Code has been put into effect. And that's why it can't be misread as the capitals terminator, because we know there's a UEB symbol, .63, that says, hey, some other indicator said everything is capitals until I tell you otherwise. And I'm telling you otherwise. I'm ending capitals here. That's the UEB meaning of the .63. The Nemeth Code meaning of the .63 is single word switch indicator. And that only happens after Nemeth Code has been turned on by the opening Nemeth Code indicator. These listings here on the slide in the box are exactly like you would see these listings for symbols on a special symbols page. They have the 2-cell dot locator for mention at their very beginning. Then there's the symbol we're identifying. It happens to all be 2 cells in this case. And our actual name of the symbol starts with a capital letter. And the Nemeth Code terminator, as well as the single word switch indicator, are both identified in parentheses as Nemeth Code symbols. Just a word to the wise. I have to have this reminder every once in a while. Whenever we have examples that look a lot like the print that's in front of us, but are not absolutely exactly the same, we have to avoid the temptation to kind of use a pickaxe to mine out exactly those dots and just paste them right into what we're transcribing. It is vanishingly rare that an example you see is exactly like the print that you are transcribing. So we got to take the concepts from the examples we have and apply those concepts to transcribe exactly the print that's in front of us. This is very much related to what we were looking at in the Braille Blasters ASCII Math Hub. I told you that I use the ASCII Math Hub's math category examples on a regular basis because I can choose an example that looks like or uses the same codes and materials as the print that I have. For example, rise over run is a fraction. So I chose the fraction 1, 2, 3 over 12 plus 3. And then based on that template, I go in and put in the specific material that I have in my print. I can't just transcribe rise over run by entering 1, 2, 3 over 1, 2 plus 3. And that's just our word to the wise to avoid picking out exactly the dots in the example and pasting them whole hog into our very specific print context. It's time for a poll. Poll number 3, where can you purchase math symbol reference booklets? Do you purchase them from the APH website, aph.org? Do you purchase math symbol reference booklets from the BANA website, brailleauthority.org? Do you purchase math symbol reference booklets from the Library of Congress website, loc.gov?
Well, our friends are very quick to chime in on this one here. So I'll go ahead and share with you, Kyle, that 88% said aph.org, the APH website.
Y'all are so right. You can purchase the math symbol reference booklets in print or Braille from aph.org. Before I just leave subscripts being so slick, I want to make sure we note outside of simple numeric right subscripts, we still need indicators. So if something is in a superscript position, like the very first example that we looked at in pasta, we need an indicator. The superscript indicator in Nemeth Code is .45. So x squared is the letter x, .45, and then the number 2. That is our x superscript 2. And superscripts have specific and explicit Nemeth Code rules. So in a UEB with Nemeth transcription, that material with a superscript needs to be in a Nemeth bubble, especially when the superscript is an exponent. If the subscript happens to the left, like atomic numbers, that has to have an indicator. There's no slick rule for a left subscript. In order to transcribe subscript 6 and then a capital C, we put the whole thing into a Nemeth Code bubble because our subscripts have specific and explicit Nemeth Code rules. So something with a subscript belongs in a Nemeth Code bubble. And we open with the subscript indicator. Remember, the superscript indicator was dots over at the right on the top 2 rows of the Braille cell. The subscript Nemeth Code indicator is dots over at the right in the bottom 2 rows of the Braille cell. So the subscript indicator is dots 5, 6. Then we just have our numeral 6. We go, and then we stop being in a subscript position by using a dot 5 to go to the baseline and have capital C. We opened our Nemeth Code bubble, so we have to remember to terminate it when we're done with our math and technical material. We talked about how a numeric subscript to a letter doesn't need any indicators. It's real slick. But if we're 2 levels down in the subscript position, we don't have, that's a rare enough occurrence. We don't have special slick rules for that. So if we had X sub A sub 2, right? See how the 2 is sort of connected to the lower part of the A, and that A is connected to the lower part of the X, all in print. So we transcribe these subscripts in Nemeth Code using X, subscript indicator A, subscript. So that's 2 cells of dots 5, 6, and then the numeral 2. Again, only the simple numeric right subscripts, like in the slope formula we looked at, where y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1, only those simple numeric right subscripts to a letter can do without the subscript indicator. Only they are slick. Okay, I've seen some conversation in the chat about Nemeth Code and what needs to be in Nemeth Code and where bubbles need to be and when we might not need them. You remember bubbles, right? These are bubbles. I just think of someone who's really bubbly, whose name maybe is Bubbles. I would name a golden retriever puppy Bubbles. But bubbles, for our purposes, means in a UEB with Nemeth transcription, the Nemeth Code happens between the code switch indicators that we've gotten pretty cozy with now. And between those code switches, what happens there is what I call a bubble of Nemeth Code, and that's surrounded by the UEB context. So if we are transcribing a UEB with Nemeth transcription, and a UEB with Nemeth transcription is appropriate for something like a math textbook or a geometry textbook or a standardized test for algebra or geometry or chemistry. But we wouldn't use a UEB with Nemeth code combination for probably for a biography of anyone or any novel. We wouldn't probably use UEB with Nemeth for a novel or a biography of someone, but we might use UEB with Nemeth for an explanation, even just for reading fun purposes, an explanation of Albert Einstein's E equals MC squared concept. But if it's just a biography of Albert Einstein, then that would likely be transcribed only using UEB. Maybe there's like 2 math formulas in the whole thing, and that probably doesn't necessitate using the Nemeth Code at all. So where the person who needs the transcription has said, there's enough math in here, and I need that math in Nemeth Code because that's the way that I write and read and use the language of mathematics. When the person asking for the transcription says, I need Nemeth Code, then we transcribe following the rules of UEB with Nemeth, which is what we're talking about today. In short, when you're doing UEB with Nemeth, you got to have your decimals, your fractions, Symbols of operation and comparison, we're talking about pluses, minus, division, your symbols that get combined with numbers to sort of affect their meaning, or symbols that get combined and used within expressions, percent, degree, dollar sign, any numbers or letters that are combined with those symbols or that are combined with a symbol of operation. So like a -5 is a number combined with a symbol of operation. Those got to be in Nemeth Code too. Any chemistry notation. We saw earlier H2O, for example, has the subscript, got to be in Nemeth Code. I'm not going to go too far down the chemistry rabbit hole, but there's some interesting rules about chemistry and chemical symbols, which are the letter or letters that represent a chemical element. And of course, we have to have in Nemeth Code, in our UEB with Nemeth transcriptions, equations. 2 + 2 = 4, and other technical expressions, H2O, or 4 is greater than 2, etc. So let's look at some bubbles in action. Please give me half the pizza. I don't really say this phrase because I just want the whole pizza. But if I did, it might be written this way. And if it were transcribed in UEB with Nemeth, my fraction has to be in Nemeth Code. This particular fraction in print has a slash instead of a horizontal line. So we use the slash fraction line in Nemeth Code, and that's 2 cells, dots 4, 5, 6, dots 3, 4. And my whole fraction starts with an opening fraction indicator, has just the lower cell numeral 1, our slash fraction line, the denominator 2, and the end of the fraction. And that whole fraction is in its own Nemeth Code bubble. Within the sentence, please give me half the pizza, period. In the sentence, the value of, then we have the Greek letter pi, is approximately 3.14. What do you think needs to be in Nemeth Code? Definitely the decimal, right? We said all decimals and all fractions have to be in Nemeth Code in UEB with Nemeth. The Greek letter also needs to be in Nemeth Code. That way, when it happens later on in a math expression, it's going to look the same as it did when it was being talked about here. So our transcription here would be starting in cell 3 for this paragraph. Cap the value of open Nemeth pi. It's just dots 4, 6 to say it's a Greek letter. And then the P is for the letter pi once we're in Greek letter territory. And Nemeth Code is approximately, the words is approximately. Then another Nemeth Code bubble for 3.14. End our Nemeth Code because we're done with the decimal, and then end our sentence with the period after the bubble. One more example right now for a bubble. You owe me $17, and the number 17 is combined with a $sign. $17 for yesterday's latte. Girl, this is gonna be a nice latte. A $17 latte, maybe it's big enough that you can like sit in it. Anyway, we would transcribe this starting in cell 3 for our paragraph. Cap you owe me, and then a Nemeth Code bubble for the symbol, the $sign, and the number 17. We always use a numeric indicator following our $sign for, I think that's right. You should check me and see if this numeric indicator after the $sign is necessary for the 17 that's combined with a $sign. I know it has to be in a Nemeth Code bubble. That's what we're here for. For the second example, I see a question, make it one Nemeth phrase with dots 6, 3 before approximately. So thank you for pointing this out. In the second example here on Bubbles Examples 1, we have the sentence, the value of pi is approximately 3.14, period. And the pi has to be in Nemeth Code. All our Greek letters have to be in Nemeth Code. And then all of our decimals have to be in Nemeth Code. Between these two items that have to be in Nemeth Code, we have 2 words that are part of the sentence structure. If we just had one word, then we could use that single word switch that we met earlier, .63. But we have two words between chunks of material that need to be in Nemeth code, two words between bubbles, which means we have to have separate bubbles, and we need to go outside of a bubble to transcribe our two words is approximately. Okay, we looked in brief at what has to be in Nemeth code. In a more detailed list, mathematical expressions and fragmentary math expressions. So something like 2 + 2 = 4, and also 2 + 2. Those always have to be in Nemeth code. Even something just the plus has to be in Nemeth code, all of our symbols of operation. A slash meaning per, over, or divided by. So when a slash means per, over, or divided by, it essentially is a symbol of operation because it's indicating division. A chemical formula or a chemical symbol. So H2O is a chemical formula, and a chemical symbol is the individual letter or the couple of letters that represents a chemical element. So He for helium, or H for hydrogen. We saw C earlier for carbon. Each of those is a chemical symbol. It's the letter or collection of letters that represents a chemical element. Then our symbols that often happen in math expressions, anywhere these appear, they need to be in Nemeth code. Percent, degree, monetary symbols. Usually we see the $, but hey, if you run into the symbol for pounds sterling or the Japanese yen, those monetary symbols need to be transcribed consistently in Nemeth code in UEB with Nemeth transcriptions. Yeah. Any number or letter that's modified by being combined with anything that we've seen so far, those symbols or the slash or any symbol of operation or comparison. Letters from non-Roman alphabets. That's why our Greek pi earlier was in Nemeth code. Fractions and mixed numbers. Mixed numbers are just a fraction combined with a whole number to make a value. So they include a fraction, and any fraction has to be in Nemeth code. And any expression that consists of words and mathematical symbols. I think the most straightforward example of that is something like 2 puppies plus 2 puppies equals 4 puppies. That whole expression is in Nemeth code, including the word puppies, because it's part of the math expression, which includes mathematical symbols, the plus and the equals. And I just want to back up for a minute to return to my doubt about examples 1 and the bubbles. I feel confident this numeric indicator, thank you for the chat notes, that's between a numeral and a $sign in Nemeth code, that doesn't need to be there. The $sign gives us enough to hold on to before the lower cell number, and we don't need the numeric indicator. Thanks for catching that, Braille. So what do we mean by a slash, meaning per, over, or divided by? For example, if I had how much do you make in $/hour or dollars per hour? Oh, you make 15, huh? Then 30% sign of your monthly income would be about 790.0 dollars. So the things that need to be in Nemeth code here are the dollars per hour. That slash means per, so it's got to be in Nemeth code. And then its sort of numerator and denominator for the slash have to be in Nemeth code as well. The percent sign just always belongs in Nemeth code so that we consistently use the same symbol, both in math expressions and in talking about percents. So in a UEB with Nemeth transcription, we're always going to use the .4, .356 for percent. And our last bubble here is for the decimal, because our decimals always go in Nemeth code in a UEB with Nemeth transcription, 790.00. And the Nemeth code decimal is .46. If it were the UEB period for the decimal, it would look like a 4. Please note in our dollars per hour, we didn't use any transcriptions because in Nemeth Code bubbles, we use no contractions, no group signs, no word signs, no contractions at all. That's the way that a UEB with Nemeth transcription works. Anywhere within a Nemeth Code bubble, there are no contractions. So we've been talking a lot about what has to be in Nemeth, right? What do we have to put in bubbles? But there are a couple of things in addition to just text that isn't part of any calculation. There are a couple of other things where we can remind ourselves to keep in UEB, outside of the bubbles. We're talking about titles of figures, tables. Often these will be a series of illustrations that are labeled something like figure 1.A, or please take a look in your appendix at table 17.1. Okay, those are not decimals. Those are just periods separating the section and subsections in a title. So if you have a title of a figure or table and it's using a decimal in a way that's, or it's using a period in a way that's not a decimal, that goes in UEB. Keep that outside the bubble. Our numbers and letters that aren't modified, even when they're variables. What is the value of X, for example? Or I am 15 years old. Those sorts of unmodified letters and numbers go outside the bubble. If they're part of a greater expression, then that pulls them into the bubble. But if we're just talking about the variable X, sometimes it's used to represent an unknown value, then that letter stays in UEB. Just like our periods in titles we talked about that aren't decimals, a slash that's not meaning per, over, or divided by, so that's working as punctuation, that goes outside the bubble. So dates, when we write, what is today? 04/25/2022, those slashes are not representing any sort of mathematical calculation. They're functioning as punctuation, and they go outside the bubble. So here are some popped bubble examples. I don't know why this is the voice that I have to use for figure titles, but refer to figure 3.2 to answer questions 4-7 or 4 through 7. There's no need for Nemeth Code for any part of this sentence. Simply all in UEB. Refer to figure number 3, period 2 to answer questions 4-7. Or 525,600, and then the abbreviated word minutes, MIN, period. That's 525,600 and MIN, period. So this is a simple unmodified number, just has a comma, no big, not part of a greater calculation or math expression. And this is just an abbreviation of a word. No calculation or math expression happening here, no decimal, no fraction. It's all UEB outside of the Nemeth Code bubbles. And in dates, these slashes are functioning as punctuation in the sentence on 10/16/1918, Dr. Nemeth was born. There's no call for any Nemeth Code in this sentence. It's just all in UEB. Do you have any burning questions about those examples or about popped bubbles?
There was one question that I wanted to circle back to. One of our audience members put into the chat about recipes. Are they literary? Should they be brailled in UEB? And that math and time within literary context should also be brailled in UEB. So I'm not sure if I clarified that. I tried just to read directly from what the chat was.
Sure. The first question, I think I can answer pretty coherently, though I'm going to sort of answer it twice. For transcribing recipes, they include a lot of fractions, right? You get half a teaspoon of baking soda or whatever. And if you were asked to transcribe them using UEB with Nemeth, each of those fractions, including their associated abbreviation, would have to be in a Nemeth Code bubble. My first answer to the question, do recipes need to be transcribed using UEB with Nemeth, is, can you ask the user? This is sort of what NFB said in response to the discussion about what students were going to use, whether it was UEB or UEB with Nemeth. And they said, you gotta do what's best for the individual Braille user. So if you are transcribing a recipe for an individual Braille user, I would say the best and most appropriate transcription is the one that works best for them. That's my first answer. And that's my dream scenario, that we could go right to the person who's going to use the material and say, what code combination do you need for this document? That's a dream scenario because we often don't have access to the end user. And that means sometimes we have to rely on an intermediary to tell us what code combination the end user or users will need. And I know that feels like a cop-out, but I think I can only reasonably say the best transcription of recipes is the transcription, either UEB math/science or UEB with Nemeth, that works best for the end user.
And I just need to pause for one moment.
All right. Having said that, I just want to note one more time, we can get a lot of help in the kitchen from these supportive training agencies, CTE BVI in California, VAVF that's based in Florida, NBA, no, not the basketball, the National Braille Association. And we already talked about Project Inspire. And I know I saw some talk in the chat about how those lessons have multiple pieces. And while they do take up some time, they can be really helpful and engaging. Those resources are out there, and I encourage you to delve into them. We have another poll, but I'm just going to go quickly through the answer choices. We looked earlier at a transcription of a double-headed arrow over the letters MN. This question is about a double-headed arrow directly over the letters CD. And the correct transcription of this print is answer choice A, where we open our modification, we capitalize our letters individually, we have a directly over indicator, and then the 5 cells that give us the shape of the double-headed arrow and the terminator at the end of our modified material. And all of that is within our Nemeth Code switch indicators. It's worth noting for this particular question that answer choice B would be the correct transcription of CD with a line segment. So line segment CD. It just has a horizontal line and no arrowheads above it. This is another common notation in geometry. And the modifier that means that horizontal line is simply the cell 156. We just talked about bubbles at length. So if you're looking at another question here, we have which of the following does not have to be within Nemeth Code switch indicators? Is it the fraction 1/2, the number 1,298, the number 5 with a $sign before it, or the plus minus symbol? It's the simple unmodified number 1,298. That's a lot like the 525,600 that we saw earlier. It has a comma, but it's not combined with a monetary symbol or a symbol of operation. It can just be in UEB. So in summary, we talked about how lower cell numbers allow us to use fewer Braille indicators because of that slick, because of that good looking lower numbers that are always different from letters. We create bubbles by using the opening Nemeth Code indicator and the Nemeth Code terminator, so we can have our Nemeth Code material in Nemeth Code within the UEB context. APH's math symbol reference booklets are convenient and concise, available from aph.org. We transcribe letters with subscript numbers using our very slick, just having the number following right after the letter. We don't need any subscript because any number following right after a letter is automatically a subscript, like an H2O. And templates, kind of like the examples in the ASCII Math Hub in Braille Blaster, having somewhere we can go to pull out the codes or symbols and then enter our specific information within them helps to make our work more efficient. There we go.
It is great, Kyle. Thank you so much for being with us here today. You can see that her contact information is on this closing slide so that if you want to reach out to her directly, what you tackled today is hard stuff or it is to me. And the explanations that you gave, Kyle, were often so clear. And you do it with a captivated audience. You make it easier to digest. And I adore the humor that is also put into things because it is a dry subject. It can be. And I love how you're able to make this lively and fun and engaging. So, and I'm always marveling, just the last bit of kudos for you. I marvel at how fluid you are at being able to provide explanations with ease. So I know this information will translate so well to our audience here today. And I look forward to getting this posted as our archived webinar. Thank you for all of this time that you have poured into to help us use Nemeth Code correctly within UEB and for all of the examples.
It is my pleasure. I'm very happy to talk about these bubbles. I love them very much. And the Braille transcription audience and the Braille transcribers and teachers of the visually impaired out there working so hard deserve all of the humor that they can get.
It's hard stuff, but thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sticking it out just a little bit longer so that we could tie up these loose ends. We ask that you come back and join us again for Access Academy in the future.
Thanks, Amy.